Hi, this is Peter van Eyck, and today I'm interviewing Lee Newcombe, who has produced an update of his book, Securing Cloud Services, A Pragmatic Guide. Hi, Lee, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Peter. How are you?
Great, great. So let's dive into this immediately. We agreed on some questions, but so the first question would be, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into cloud and cloud security. It's been a while, isn't it?
It's been a long time, yes. So I've been working in security since 1998, originally starting off doing lots of system access control for one of the big retail banks in the UK, but then moved into, I guess, more fun activities like pen testing and incident response, then started moving towards security architecture. In terms of the cloud stuff, I was quite lucky in that around 2008, I was doing some work for the UK public sector, working on a quite complex system that had lots of different stakeholder organizations with lots of shared responsibilities all over the place. But at that point as well, I also got invited by Intellect, which is the UK trade body, to take part in a project that they were working with the UK government CIO Council. And that turned into the UK G Cloud initiative. So
It's 2008. That's really, really early days for cloud, right?
Yeah, it was really early days at that point. Still lots of nervousness about it. I think probably the lucky thing in the UK was that public sector IT at that point wasn't necessarily in the best place. So the idea of having public services hosted in secure data centers is probably a lot more reassuring to the relevant stakeholders than where some of these servers used to be kept.
Right, in broom closets and stuff like that.
I couldn't possibly comment, but it was really lucky at that point that I got dragged into G Cloud at that point. So I stayed heavily involved in cloud since around 2008, 2009. Lots of work with government, lots of work with very large organizations as well. So most of the people that I tend to work with are kind of FTSE 100 style customers.
Right.
Which, again, I think from my perspective has been very lucky, because when you're working with organizations of that size, the major cloud providers are always
actually do want to talk to you.
Yeah. So
yeah, exactly.
You get lots of good insight.
Right. And is that also about the time that you got involved in the Cloud Security Alliance?
Yes. So I was a name contributor to, I think it's the second edition. If it wasn't the second edition, it was the third edition of the core guidance document for the CSA. And then I got involved in the UK chapter as well. I spent 2 years as the acting chair of the chapter, and then I handed that across to Francesco Cipollone last year. So
right, and he's still doing that. Yeah, he was on a call yesterday with me. Yeah, but let's get back to the book. What led you to first write the first version, obviously, and then we should segue into the second edition, because that's really the reason why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I wrote the first version back in 2011.
Right.
And I was driven at that point.
This one, right?
That one, yes. Oh, fun memories. Yeah, I was really driven by it is that word pragmatic. So when it talks about being a pragmatic guide, that was what was driving me, because back at the time there was an awful lot of theoretical guidance about how you can do cloud and what cloud was. And I kind of got a little bit bored of seeing the same kind of bland, high level, and this is how it should work, and this is how cloud providers work. And none of it was necessarily deliverable from a practical perspective. So I wanted to put out something that was a bit more informative and it would help people make their decisions when they were adopting cloud.
More the science fiction thinking that was going on in a number of publications at the time, right? Like, the future is going to look like this. Yeah, but what's it going to look like today, right?
Yeah, and the problem was always security as an industry can be quite absolutist. It's very black and white at times, and you can do this, you can't do this, you must do this, you mustn't do that.
Exactly, all those imperatives.
Yeah, it's not the way IT risk tends to work in the enterprise. There's always going to be a balancing act there. And if you're going to do that balancing act, then you need to understand what the actual risks are and what the actual benefits are. And I didn't see anything providing that kind of guidance at the time, which is why I wrote the book. And it's also why I got involved in the UK chapter as well. I wanted to get away from the usual talking heads, talking stuff.
Right.
And
Yeah, and I think one of the most distinguishing features of that book, I think, was let me pull up the page. It's like these diagrams, right? And as you can see, there was I actually pasted in the colored version of the diagram thanks to you sending it to me. With a bit of a lapse of the publisher side at that point, I think. But the diagram actually shows like an enterprise architecture model that illustrates through colors the shared responsibility model for a specific service model. That's right, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So
And that's a thing that you made up as your security reference model, right? That's your contribution mainly. Well,
it
mainly a lot more
is.
contribution, but it's a core of the contribution, I think.
It is a core of the book. So it's a set of conceptual security services. So what is it we want to deliver from a security perspective? And then what the book dives into is how you deliver those security services
Yeah,
using
yeah,
the capabilities that are available within the different cloud providers, or also where you can use third-party tooling as well to deliver those capabilities. So
yeah,
the way
yeah,
the book's structured and one of the core, I guess, ethos of the book is that I'm not going to tell people how exactly to deliver each service. I'm going to give people options as to how those services can be delivered, because then the sensible architect can decide which is the best fit for what they're working on at the time.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
there are always some key decisions that when you start
Right,
working in cloud, you have to think about, such as, am I going to go with the native tooling first, or am I going to rely on third-party tooling? And there are lots of different
exactly.
factors that
Yeah,
drive the
yeah,
right decision there. Some of it comes down to corporate culture. Some of it comes down to familiarity with the tools. Some of it comes down to resourcing.
yeah.
Do you have enough?
And that's what I like particularly about your approach, and that is that you give this security architecture perspective, where architecture is kind of like high level engineering. We say, here's the that we need to fill in. What are the options for doing that? And security requirements are requirements like any other requirement.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, great. That's as I said, that's what I like. Now, obviously, there was a trigger to update it to the second edition, and could you tell a bit more about that? So, how did you? What was the driving force around that, and then what's new in edition two? In the second edition.
Yeah, I was going to say I drafted the book in 2011, the first edition, and that was some 9 years ago now. So in
A long
cloud
time.
years, in cloud years, it's positively ancient.
Yeah.
So a great deal has changed in the cloud landscape since then. Cloud years are a bit like dog years. Uh, so in terms of what's changed, I think consolidation is certainly an issue. So now the big three hyperscale cloud providers are actually dominant when it comes to infrastructure as a service. So one of the changes in this book is now that I focus much more on the top three rather than trying to cover a wider spectrum of cloud
Yeah.
providers. So there's much more focus on Amazon, Google, and Microsoft in this book. But it's not just IaaS as well. When you start thinking about platform as a service, there's been some consolidation there as well. So Salesforce now own Heroku, for example. So this consolidation is happening
Yeah.
elsewhere. And then also when you start thinking about other changes, I guess the biggest one is the more recent rise of functions as a service. So Lambda, Azure functions, they're becoming more common now.
Yep. Yeah, I noticed that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, well, sometimes that's going to drive a whole new way of doing security because of the ephemeral nature of those services. You can't necessarily install agents on there. It's harder to get the visibility, so you need to start thinking about how are you going to get the visibility and observability of those services that you're building using functions as a service. So that changes the way you have to think a little bit. So the book's got a little bit of guidance in there as to what your options are in those spaces around securing functions as a service.
And the big one, DevOps, which was completely not there 8 years ago, and which is now the driving force for many companies to adopt cloud and cloud-like ways of working, right?
Yeah, DevOps is fun. I'm not sure I've yet found an organization that's got the balance between the dev and the ops right. I think it very much depends upon people's background. Sometimes dev, little ops, sometimes little dev, big ops. And then trying to get the security around there as well is another challenge. Because again, I think going back to that discussion earlier about theory versus practice, there's lots of good theory about how DevOps, DevSecOps, SecDevOps, call it whatever you really want to call it, how that could work.
Mm-hmm.
But at the moment, I think there are few organizations that have got that working properly, and those organizations are probably not lots of the organizations that I start work with.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, when you start thinking about the major enterprises, they've got so much legacy culture that they have to work around, that moving towards these new models is it's going to take them quite a long time to develop.
Right.
So
Right.
you'll tend to find a little center of excellence there, and maybe a few skunk works throughout the organization that's doing some of this stuff, but they won't necessarily have that kind of centrally coordinated approach. This is the right way to do it.
Exactly. And it is actually possible to do secure DevOps, right?
Yeah, it is, and that is one of the benefits of moving to the cloud model, is that you can build in your security from the outset. And when you start looking at the capabilities that you've got with things like Amazon, with AWS organizations, service control policies, you can put those technical guardrails in right from the start. And you can do something similar with Azure, with Azure policy management groups. And that, again, comes down to those really big architectural decisions you have to make at the start of this process, which is, how am I going to segment my new cloud environment to get away from that whole legacy mess of a flat network, which you tend to find in far too many organizations.
Still, right?
Yeah, but cloud gives you the opportunity to try and get away from that. So building your segmentation. Think about, am I going for account-centric segmentation? Am I going for...
Right. And
you have options.
And that's the big kind of question that you need to develop from an architectural security architecture perspective, right? And is that what is that the type of say function in the organization that your book is aimed at? Or let's talk about who this book is for, and maybe just to be specific also, who is this book not for?
So I tried to go for a fairly wide audience with the book. So the introduction in the first chapter is very much an overview of cloud and all the issues associated with cloud. So kind of threat models, the background of cloud, some of the legal considerations as well around privacy. So the first section is very much an introduction for everybody. The second section is, again, quite general, but is aimed more at architects. So in terms of who it's for, I'd see it as being for business stakeholders who want to get a better understanding of cloud and what they can do with cloud. It's also aimed at architects to give them the guidance as to where they should be thinking in terms of options. Who it's not aimed for, and it's very clearly not aimed for, and I even call it out in the bump for the book. It's not aimed at people looking for code snippets. So if you're looking for sample IAM policies, you're not going to find them in this book. It doesn't go down to that level of detail, because if I tried to do that for all the different cloud models, it would be a whole series of books. Rather
maybe here's a plan. You never know, right? but that still has to fit into one book, right?
It does, yes, and now with color pictures as well, so it's a definite improvement on the first edition because all the diagrams.
That was a sore thumb, right?
It was something that people pointed out, and to be fair, I think there's probably just a miscommunication with the publisher back in 2011. But
it's a fun anecdote, and this has all been settled, right? So maybe to dive into some of the more practical experiences that have been incorporated into the second edition. Obviously, you can't mention names of companies, although except when they're providers. But some of the lessons learned, or the stuff that keeps popping up all the time, some of the common issues that you've seen sort of crystallize, that would be well worth noting for people to whenever they and presumably your book will be helpful in that. So some of the practical anecdotes potentially, or developments.
Yeah, so I will start with some of the more governance-related issues, to be fair, because I think those are the ones that people tend to forget about. People sometimes jump straight to the technology.
Right.
But it's actually around governance. So who's driving your cloud strategy? Who's considering the risk? Who's signing off all of this stuff? Do they have the power and the support from the top to push through any kind of consistency? So
right.
when I'm talking about consistency, I'm not necessarily talking about centralized control. I'm just talking about somebody who has a level of accountability and responsibility for making sure that this cloud adoption is taking place in a controlled manner, where you can distribute and delegate out those responsibilities to business units. What you don't want to do is have different business units going off doing their own thing in an uncontrolled manner, because at that point you end up with a whole variety of different technologies potentially doing the same job. So you end up with duplication of both technology and function and different ways of working. And then the thing that hasn't changed since 2011 is the prevalence of shadow IT, because there are still so many organizations making use of lots of cloud services that they're not aware of until they start looking at it in a bit more detail.
Like shadow cloud, as I've heard it called these days.
Yeah, it's just a massive problem for lots of organizations who still don't necessarily understand which cloud services they're using, and therefore whereabouts their people are sending their data and their customers' data.
And then this actually is going to become a worse problem now, as cloud services proliferate. So, for example, in your experience, what's the number of cloud services or potentially SaaS services that your average customer employs, or that they know of?
Yeah.
Ballpark figure, as Americans would say.
So I worked with one organization who started looking into this problem, and they worked with one of the Casby vendors who came in, and they identified that they had used 6,000 SaaS services over 6 months. They had 400 in their CMDB. So they knew about 400 of them, but they were still about 5,500 SaaS services at that point. And the thing is, when you hear lots of stories about, well, that's just one of the Casby vendors, and they'll categorize everything as a SaaS service, so it's not really as bad as it looks. So I started digging into the data, and it sounded, because you end up trying to prioritize how you respond to that, and it's not necessarily easy when each of these services has got over 100 users.
Yeah, so you have like thousands of services, each employing hundreds of users at least. That's a governance challenge if ever there was one, isn't it?
It is. So I think the general advice there has got to be try and stop that as early in the process as you can do, because otherwise it gets out of control.
Yeah, and those are great, real life data points that I think everybody in the outside and the outer world is interested in. Any more of these anecdotes of stuff that you ran into, like, okay, was this big, or stuff like that, or this hard, or this easy? I don't know.
I think there are some changes since the first edition of the book. So with the first edition of the book, I think identity was still a major problem, trying to sort out identity across cloud landscapes. I think technology has moved on a lot since then, and nowadays there are some really solid, well-tested examples of how to manage identity across cloud. So you've got Azure AD now. I'm seeing Azure AD used a lot more now as a central source of identity across the wider cloud landscape. So people still control their Amazon access via identities held in Azure AD as well. And then you've got your third-party providers as well, the likes of Okta, who again you can start using to manage identity. And then you have the whole fun of zero trust, which is becoming much more prevalent these days as well.
Right.
Again,
trust is a vulnerability, right?
Well, I don't know. Being an old timer, I was around when the Jericho Forum was still doing its commandments, and it talks about deperimeterization. I tend to see.
It all happened.
Yeah, well, zero trust is really just an implementation and instantiation of those whole old Jericho principles around deperimeterization. And as been doing some other side plugging, I did have a blog on pragmatic zero trust on the Capgemini website, which gives a bit more detail of my views on zero trust. But essentially, that whole idea that every access request has to establish its credentials before it's serviced, I think is a good architectural approach to take, because at that point you have to start thinking about, well, how can I establish trust in this request? And I think that's the problem with the term zero trust, is it people take it too far, and they don't tend to view it as zero trust as the start of the process, not the end of the process. So you start from a position of zero trust and you build that trust before you service the request.
It's the baseline, it's the departure point rather than the end of the journey.
Indeed.
And I must say, as I was going through the book, I noticed that you have a fairly detailed explanation of how to approach identity management and the architecture around it, much better than I've ever seen. As a matter of fact, now I haven't read all of it, but the subtleties between the policy enforcement point and the policy information point, and how that actually plays out in the current cloud world, where it actually is applicable. And as I said, the identity is the final perimeter, and I guess what I always tell my CCSK students is, identity is your very right. It's your first, your last, your everything in terms of cloud security. And I think people should be buying your book just for that section alone. But sorry, that's a plug. But I'm not.
Yes,
you're probably not complaining about that. But let's have some more anecdotes to drive this forward, because I guess people listening to this and watching us, two grumpy old men, would still need find some value in practical advice, and practical experience as actually better than practical advice. Just the scars and the bruises and the arrows on the back and all that stuff. That's really what's guiding us technologists forward, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we've touched on a little bit of this earlier on, which is around the decision you have to make between cloud native tooling and third-party tooling.
Right, that's also an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah, well, another good example of that at the moment with a client I was working with earlier this year is around vulnerability management. So you can now see that the cloud providers getting a lot better at that. So you've got Amazon Security Hub, you've got all the goodies within Security Center for Azure, you've got Google working with its security health analytics tooling now as well. So the cloud provider offerings are definitely improving in this area. But I think they're still not necessarily as mature, particularly when it comes to reporting, as third-party tooling. And I think the other issue that I've seen lots of organizations struggling with at the moment is that split between traditional vulnerability management at the kind of operating system and above layer, and then the stuff you need to do on the cloud provider platform itself. So typically, we'll see to do the operating system and above vulnerability management, and then they'll think that will also cover them for how their Amazon or Azure platforms have been configured as well. And sometimes that visibility isn't quite as good as you might expect it to be. So it's important to recognize that split between the cloud platform and the hosted workloads, and put the right tooling in place to check the vulnerability of both of those layers.
Great, yeah. And what about, let's say, some kind of vulnerability management of SaaS providers, because there are like way many more of them than the big infrastructure providers, although maybe your workloads on the infrastructure may be as varied as the SaaS providers, but SaaS providers vary wildly in competence, as we've discovered. Anything on that in terms of how do you manage 5,000 SaaS providers?
Yeah, so there are two sides to that one as well. So you're probably not going to get to pen test a SaaS provider very often, but what you will have to do at that point is go through all of their due diligence documentation. So check that they have the relevant kind of SOC 2 TAP reports available for you to download, have a read of those. Put my Cloud Security Alliance hat on. Have they got entries in the STAR registry that you can? Yeah,
the STAR registry.
And
very good.
Get a view on what they claim they do in terms of more pragmatic and proactive risk management. I think that is when you're going to have to fall back to a CASB at that point to act as in some ways well, you have lots of different options with the CASBs as to how you deploy them, which is again something new in version 2 of the book. There are a bit of a description there in the different CASB deployment models. But if you do choose to use them as a proxy, then you can have them in line and try and control access to these SaaS services. Otherwise, you can fall back on the API level as well. But there's always going to be that but, is if people aren't using corporate devices and they're just going direct from their mobile phone to a SaaS provider, then there is probably little you can do at this point other than try and do the whole user awareness training.
Yeah, it's a multi-tiered approach, definitely. And but I think, do you see much use of the CASBs providing a threat intelligence function, because they will bring an additional perspective on your cloud workloads?
Yeah, so when you're using your CASB to do your service discovery, then the CASBs will give you risk ratings per the suppliers that they identify, and that's a good benefit of these of these CASB providers. And it's probably actually a differentiation factor as well between the different CASBs in terms of how well they do that service provider catalog and risk view.
Great. So I know we've talked about your experiences in how things have developed. What do you still see as the number one mistakes that organizations are making when it comes to either adopting cloud or evolving and maturing their cloud approach? We're talking about let's talk about like people, process, technology. Where are they making in each of those the biggest mistakes from your perspective, which is obviously not the whole world, but you have a bit of significant enterprise perspective, and you're seeing most of the cloud providers on a regular basis.
This is the one that always gets me into trouble with my colleagues. I have a real thing about lift and shift, where organizations take existing workloads and just take that design and tooling and process with them into the cloud as a proof of feasibility. Because eventually what tends to happen is that proof of feasibility becomes their long-term approach to cloud. So they're just doing the same things in the same ways with the same tools, just on the cloud rather than in their legacy data center.
So this to lift and shift, or how is it like avoid, right?
Yeah, don't do it unless you really have to. Unless you're getting kicked out of your data center in the next few months, try and.
Yeah, well, it's exactly. A friend of mine talked to me about his company's cloud journey. It's like, yeah, no, we're doing lift and shift. And why would you do that? Well, they're having some really peculiar hardware that has a really peculiar price range. So the business model was not like they had a cheap data center, and then it might make sense. But yeah, as you said, you're not developing your cloud native architecture in that particular way. So yeah, that's a great example. You have another example, Ali.
Just earlier on around the culture change. Organizations have to invest in the people that they're going to be using and relying upon to run their cloud infrastructures for them. It's not fair to just retask their existing staff to work on cloud without giving them the training that they need. And sometimes I will see people within acclaimed cloud center of excellence who are just rebadged from previous roles within the organization.
Rebadging, I like that word, right?
Yeah, it's not fair on the people who get that responsibility at that point, and it's not doing the organization any favors either.
They're thrown in at the deep end, and how can they succeed?
Yeah, so there have been a few organizations that have done it well, that have given the guys the training that they need, and they're doing well in the cloud. Others will struggle because what they'll tend to do is they'll have this claim center of excellence that will have a few rebadged internal resources in there, but then they'll bring in lots of external consultants. Like myself, I guess, or other people to come in. But these external guys are typically only there for a short period of time anyway, and at that point, there's a kind of a real lack of resilience for those organizations in how their cloud deployments are going to go.
Great warning. And of course, training is a hobby horse of mine, being a full-time CCSK trainer as well as working in the university. So maybe I'm loading the question here, but just your honest opinion on the target audience for your book. What should they do in terms of training? And I know CCSK is one of the answers, and if you say that's the best they can have, that's fine by me. But if there's other stuff that they should be doing, I just have your honest opinion, if it's possible at all at this point.
Yeah, so I tend to point people new to cloud to both CCSK and CCSP, the ISC squared equivalent, as being the appropriate starting points, because that gives you the wide overview of cloud.
And of course, training.
And then I just point people towards the vendor training. So the Amazon training, the Microsoft training, those certification paths are the good way to go at that point.
Those companies are doing a fairly decent job of security training, but it's obviously very focused on their platforms.
Yeah, it is. But that's something that we didn't really cover earlier on. But again, it's something that I'm quite opinionated about, is the whole idea of multi-cloud and
Let's have that. Let's have that opinion to start wrapping up this story. And if we get good viewer response, we may have an additional episode. Who knows, Lee?
Yeah, but
Multi-cloud.
oh, it,
Oh, don't get me started on that.
no, it's the whole kind of question about workload portability and how much complexity you have to build into your solutions to enable you to move a workload from one cloud to another. And is that actually worth it? And are you in fact just abstracting yourself away from the core benefits of the cloud platforms that you've chosen? So I much prefer people to have a really good understanding of a single cloud platform, get themselves used to that, and then if they
Yeah.
need to have other clouds, then again start the process again, rather than trying to know everything about everything and then putting endless layers of abstraction on top of that. So we end up with containerized workloads you can move across the clouds, and then everything falls over because it's just far too complex. So going back to your training question, that's why I point people towards the vendor certifications, because I think they need to really understand what they're doing on a single platform before they try and do everything on every platform, because that just gets expensive from either a training perspective or resourcing perspective, because you'll probably end up with different people looking after different platforms.
And did you have what's your actual experience with clients or companies that you know in trying to get to that let's say to executing on that single cloud strategy, and what the type and level of training is that is actually bringing in a good ROI?
So what I tend to see in the big organizations is that they'll have multiple cloud providers because they're massive organizations, but what they won't try and do is have workload portability between those cloud providers, except in one sector. So you may have different cloud providers for different workloads, and I don't have a problem with that because it's one workload, one cloud. So you might have, say, Amazon for vanilla infrastructure as a service. You might have Azure for doing some big data stuff. You might have Google for doing machine learning and AI. Different workloads, different providers. That's kind of fine. That makes sense if you've got the cash to get the resources in that you need to build it. The one exception to that is around financial services, where I've seen a few of the big financial services organizations interpret the regulatory guidance as meaning that they have to have that workload portability. So at that point, I see organizations making use of things like OpenShift to try and have that on top of say Amazon and Microsoft, and then try and have that workload portability across those providers.
And that's an interpretation of the regulator's perspective. And that's we're not here to argue with that, right?
No, that would be a whole separate interview around the regulatory requirements. But that causes, again, some interesting conversation at that point about what services can be shared across the different cloud providers. So when you start thinking about, particularly that environment, encryption and key management, so can they have a shared key management solution across all the different cloud providers that the different workloads can rely upon?
That's a complicated thing in and of itself. I think you could write a PhD on key management across cloud providers. I've had a look at that. I have some opinions on key management myself, but you probably want to look at my Google example to see the point there. But that's again, I saved that for my students because we're here to interview you about this book. And any other, we need to wrap this up, otherwise it's going to be too long to watch. Any other famous last words I was saying? Any stuff that you feel, well, it's really important to bring this message across as a parting thought almost?
I guess as a parting thought, and I hate to end on a downer, but I think I will do, is because we are all concentrating now on the big three from a workload perspective, that whole systemic risk question is becoming a bit more high profile now. So it's something that I think lots of organizations and regulators do need to look into a little bit more, is how comfortable are they with having everything on either Amazon, Microsoft or Google technologies. I think that's something that will become more of a consideration over the next few years.
Yeah, and Sure, from a policy, I mean, like a industry policy almost, an economic policy perspective, that sounds like something that as an industry we want to have a look at, or as a government. What would be a rational decision by an individual company with respect to the systemic issue?
I don't have answers for everything, Peter.
Well, you could have some thoughts,
Yeah, it's a really complex question. I think at the moment, organizations can only work with the options they've got available to them. And at the moment, those top three are the ones that have got the most capabilities. You've got other options as well, but in the current climate, I doubt many people will be looking at Alibaba, for example, for alternative cloud provision. There are initiatives in Europe to try and set up another big cloud provider as well. Oh God, the name escapes me at the moment.
The OpenX or something. There's an X in there. All right, I'll save you my opinions on that. Other than the question, is cloud here to stay? Because I think the concept of cloud is probably more important for companies to realize. And once they've learned to work with that, even a massively disrupting event like the demise of a hyperscale provider would still be survivable. You look at COVID-19. Nobody who was managing supply chains was treating that risk, and then for some reason we're still finding, and we're still alive. It's going to be massive damage, but we're still alive.
Yeah, no, the cloud has been extremely helpful in helping organizations to continue operations during the current pandemic.
Yeah, and that's indeed another nice thing to think about. But again, that doesn't shouldn't distract us from the systemic risk. And again, if you look at before we were all dependent on cloud, we were not dependent on cloud. So we managed to make that transition. And if there's another, the cloud's not going to go away. Maybe a cloud provider is going to go away, but it will be replaced by another one, and we'll just have to do another migration. That's the big picture story as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, we continuously evolve. I mean, if you look in previous cloud days, we were reliant upon Microsoft technologies in the data center, Oracle, SAP.
Yeah. Talk about vendor lock-in at that day and age, right?
Yeah. I guess the only difference now is that we're relying on their data centers and their operational services rather than just their
right. Yeah. You can go. If Microsoft were to die 10 years ago, you would still have the software. If they die now, you don't have the service. And that's a huge difference. Okay, Lee, we really have to wrap this up. That's been great fun. Once again, this is the book. Go read it for practical advice. If you are in an architectural position, or at least in a not too detailed into the technology, then this is definitely going to give you the framework to piece things together. And especially if you look at those models that you have in there, I think they're more pragmatic than most of the other stuff that I've seen. So it is I wouldn't call this Cloud 101. It's that's my honest perspective. But if you really want to make a dent, then this is a must-have as far as I'm concerned. So once again, it was great talking to you, Lee, and let's see if we can meet again in the near future on this platform.
Thanks, Peter. It's been fun.